Hi, and welcome to this lecture on institutional racism. In this lecture, we will define institutional discrimination and institutional racism, set that apart from simple prejudice and simple interpersonal discrimination. We'll explain why we see high levels of residential or housing segregation in America. Specifically, we will dive into redlining and the transportation infrastructure in Atlanta, Georgia. We'll summarize the consequences of residential segregation. I will have you analyze demographic patterns and outcomes using data visualization tools. This will be more of an assignment later on for folks in my class. And we will look at the additive nature of advantage and disadvantage produced by the social structure. So we're going to introduce here the history of residential segregation, and we're going to emphasize how residential segregation, the history of it, enables institutional discrimination even in the absence of interpersonal discrimination. And this can be a difficult topic to understand because we're used to thinking about discrimination and racism and any other sort of ism as an interpersonal thing, right? I don't like people like you, and so I treat you differently. That's interpersonal discrimination or interpersonal prejudice that leads to discrimination. Instead, what we want to look at here is the fact that many present-day inequalities are results of past policies, of the institutions that exist today were not created by us. Right? They were created by people in the past who had different values, different ideas, different ideologies, and lived in very different societies than we do. Their values, their ideologies can be embedded in the rules, the policies, the laws that exist, and the ways that our societies have been shaped that affect us today. What we want to do is avoid individualizing social problems like residential segregation. That is both misplaced and it's an ineffective means to think about change. So here are your definitions. Prejudice, and the quotes here are from the textbook. Prejudice is an attitudinal bias against individuals based on their membership in a social group. Discrimination is like an expression of prejudice, or prejudice in action. It's a negative differential treatment of individuals based on their membership in a social group. So prejudice is an attitude, discrimination is treatment, the result of an attitude. Institutional discrimination is widespread and enduring practices that persistently disadvantage some kinds of people while advantaging others. That is discrimination that is not necessarily interpersonal, but that is baked into the ways that social institutions operate. We're going to look specifically at the institutions of housing and transportation. So if you put that in these terms, we're going to look at how housing, residential patterns of where we live by race, and how transportation are widespread and involve enduring practices or ways of doing housing, ways of doing transportation that persistently disadvantage some people. We're going to look at black folks, and persistently advantage other people. We're going to look at white folks. And this is historical, and it has real implications today. So racism, your definition here, is essentially institutional discrimination that produces unequal outcomes based on race or ethnicity. So your textbook definition here, society's production of unjust outcomes for some racial or ethnic groups. And again, just like discrimination, racism can be interpersonal, which is that individual expression of prejudice or discrimination, or it can be institutional, which is when those patterns of prejudice and discrimination are reflected in social institutions. So let me give you a little bit of background on something that my in-person class does. We play, after we talk about socioeconomic inequality, about social class inequality, we play a simulation of Monopoly, the board game Monopoly. It's a rigged version of Monopoly where different teams or different players get different amounts of starting money. They also get different amounts of money when they pass go. They have different access to different colored properties. So essentially, there are 5 teams in my simulation. In the simulation, Team 1 is the upper class, Team 5 is the lower class. Team 1 gets a lot of money to start. They inherit a lot of money. They get more money for passing go, so they have a higher income. Team 5 has the least amount of starting money, and they have the lowest amount of money from Pass and Go. Team 5 also can't have access to the best properties. They are prohibited from buying Boardwalk if they land on Boardwalk, for example. Whereas Team 1, the upper class, they can buy anything. If you're in my class, reach out to me. I'll give you a copy of the rules of sociopoly if you're curious. But after students play sociopoly, I ask them how they might change the rules to make them more fair, because inevitably they know, it's obvious, that the rules of sociopoly are unfair. They advantage the more wealthy players, Team 1, Team 2, and they systematically disadvantage, through the rules of the game, Teams 4 and Teams 5, the lower class players. There are also rules about how easy or difficult it is to go to jail and how you get out of jail. There are rules about the lottery, like paying into free parking. There are rules about the rules. You can't complain about the rules, for example. And if you complain about the rules, you go directly to jail. There are rules about the rules in terms of who can make new rules and who has the authority to enforce rules. And that is given to Team 1, to the upper class. So students always say two things about sociopoly. They say that they think it would be more fair if, one, there were no restrictions on who could buy what property. And they say that it would be more fair if everyone had the same starting money, or at least more similar starting money. So keep those two things in mind, that after students play this rigged simulation of social class inequality, they think that things would be fairer if there were no restrictions on who could live where, or who could purchase what property, and if everyone had the same or a really similar amount of starting money. Okay, so we're going to look at, like I said, two institutions, housing and transportation, in this lecture. Now, the first one is housing. Both of these institutions, and all institutions, like I said, have a long history. It's not just what they look like now, which is the reason they look like what they do now. It's what they used to look like and past policies that have shaped what they look like now. So here's some history on housing and where people live in the United States. Now I'm really specifically going to look at cities, and I'm specifically going to look at Atlanta, because if you're not in my class, I live in Atlanta, we live in Atlanta, so hopefully this has some relevance for students. So some key dates for you. After World War I, after the Great Depression, the United States needed to come out of that depression. So FDR proposed a suite of legislation when he was in the executive office called the New Deal. And these were a variety of social programs meant to help struggling Americans. One of the things that the New Deal policies helped with was housing. So in 1933, 1934, FDR's New Deal created what was called the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, as well as the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, or HOLC. And the purpose of the FHA and HOLC was to assess neighborhoods, to determine the value of properties in neighborhoods and the desirability of different neighborhoods. These agencies provided insurance and mortgages for homeowners. They tried to prevent foreclosures because they wanted people to purchase houses and to live in those houses and to make their payments. And so they worked with insurance companies as well, and they worked with banks to help and ensure that people were paying what they're supposed to, so that there wouldn't be foreclosures. And the FHA and HOLC tried to expand home ownership opportunities for people in the United States who were suffering in the wake of the Great Depression. In the latter half of that decade, in the 1930s, HOLC created color-coded maps that appraised investment values of areas in American cities. They appraised American cities, neighborhoods in American cities, from the best areas to the worst areas. The worst areas were called hazardous. We'll look at these in a second. But they created 4 colors, or 4 codes, A, B, C, and D. Areas that were deemed the most hazardous, or the less desirable areas, were outlined or colored in red. This is called redlining. You may have heard this before. So a redlined neighborhood is a neighborhood that, in these FHA HOLC maps back in the 1930s, which persisted through the 60s, were color-coded as red. Now, these appraisals were heavily race-based. So red or hazardous neighborhoods were primarily places where black people lived and where poor people lived. There's a class element to it too. But they were looking at cities, right? We're not looking at rural areas. We're looking at cities. And green, I believe, the A-coded areas, the best areas, were places where politically influential and more wealthy white folks lived. So these appraisals were heavily race-based. Even when you had neighborhoods of middle-class black Americans, they weren't graded well, right? They weren't going to be the Class A or Class B areas. If there was a lot of black people there, they were going to be C or D, right? Hazardous or declining, it was called. So another thing to keep in mind here regarding redlining is in 1944, the GI Bill was enacted. The GI Bill expanded access to education and housing for World War II veterans. This was a way to help veterans returning from World War II have access to education, have access to good housing, and the FHA subsidized loans for veterans returning from war to purchase houses to help them get back on their feet, right? Because they served their country. The issue with the GI Bill, which helped a lot of people, but it primarily helped white people, white veterans. Why? Well, because we're in 1944. This is the Jim Crow era in the United States, especially in the South. Things were segregated. Black people could not live in many white neighborhoods. There was legal residential segregation. And so black veterans who came back simply could not buy homes in these new white suburban neighborhoods outside of the city. They were barred from doing so. And educational institutions were also segregated. Black people coming back from the war couldn't simply use the GI Bill to apply to college and go to college, right? It was really rare for black people to go to college back then. So the GI Bill was essentially welfare for white veterans, social programs for white veterans. It helped them get housing and education, but it did not help black veterans do the same. So keep that in mind as we go through. All right. This is a map, a redlining map of Atlanta. This was drawn up, I don't have a date on this one, but these were all created in the latter half of the 1930s. So you can see, actually let me open the actual thing here. This is just a screenshot. All right. So you can see the Hulk areas by grade here. Green is best, and you can see how they described it, right? Hulk described A areas as hotspots, where good mortgage lenders with available funds are willing to make their maximum loans, perhaps up to 75 to 80% of appraisal. B-graded areas are still desirable. It's called still desirable. They're still good, but not as hot as A areas. They are neighborhoods where good mortgage lenders will have a tendency to hold commitments 10 to 15% under the limit, or around 65% of appraisal. Definitely declining neighborhoods are characterized by obsolescence and infiltration of lower grade population. What this meant was immigrants, people of color. Good mortgage lenders are more conservative in third grade or C areas and hold commitments under the lending ratio for A and B areas. And then finally, we've got the red-lined areas, those that were marked hazardous. These were characterized by detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, under desirable population, or an infiltration of it. They recommended lenders to refuse to make loans in these areas, or only on a conservative basis. So what this means is that the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and lenders for home ownership are going to be, or were going to be, the most likely to give money, to give loans to people who wanted to buy homes in the best and still desirable areas. And these were predominantly white people, right? Almost exclusively white people. And they were unlikely to give loans or to give good rates on loans to people trying to buy homes in definitely declining or hazardous areas. And this was overwhelmingly black people. So in areas that were redlined, you have in areas that were redlined, you see racial residential segregation, right? Black Americans tended to live in these redlined areas and in the definitely declining areas. White Americans tended to live in the best and still desirable areas, which means that white Americans were able to get loans to purchase houses that were already more valuable because they were in good areas, whereas black people were denied loans, were given higher interest rates, and loaners were really skeptical of giving people money to purchase in those areas, which means that black people either couldn't buy homes, the values were really low, the values often declined, and so they had to rent or live in less good conditions and all this sorts of stuff. So the conditions were very different, and we see that because the neighborhoods were graded in this way, it institutionalized, which meant it created a pattern of lending, of home ownership, of investment, and of wealth building that persisted for generations, as we will see. So you can play around with this. You can find this actually if you want to look at it, called Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America. You can click on some specific areas just to see what the descriptions are. So here's this area up in North Atlanta, Paces Ferry Road Development Company's property. It says that it's graded, what is it, blue, so it's still desirable. It's one characteristic of the area is a proximity to small Negro settlement and expansion of Buckhead Business Center. So this was seen as it's okay. Down south of it, in South Atlanta, you've got the federal prison area, proximity to federal prison, Chevrolet plant, and other industrial plants located along the Southern Railroad. So an industrial area is classified here as definitely declining. It would have also had influx of immigrants or black people as well. These red areas here, D20, Edgewood Avenue. Although this area is considered a good Negro rental area from an investment standpoint, it also contains one of the city's worst slum areas. D17. So note here, even though the area is marked as a good area for black people, aside from the slums there, even though it's a good area for some black people, it's still redlined. D17, property if acquired in this area should be held for fair value. This is known as Best Negro Area in Atlanta and contains the best type of Negro residence and highest percentage of Negro home ownership. Redlined. The best area where black people are in the whole city. Redlined. Right? So even black Americans, black Atlantans who might have been middle class, because there was a burgeoning middle class, maybe not so much in the 30s, but getting into the 50s and 60s, those areas were still redlined. It didn't matter if they were the right type of black people, right? It didn't matter if they were well-to-do, if they were the best of, an undesirable social group. Still redlined, right? The worst rating. And so you can click around in these maps and see different kinds of areas, but you see a pattern, right? You see that the majority of redlined areas in Atlanta are the south side of the city, as well as the west side of the city, but the south side of the city. And that the majority of the good or the best and still desirable areas are the north side of the city, right? Going up north, central, northeast side of the city. And let's see if there's anything else to poke around here. There's the actual map, the graded areas. You can see it in polygons. So I want you to think about this. What were the impacts on people living in redlined areas as categorized by Hulk? What were the impacts for their home ownership, for the development of infrastructure in those areas, for the development of social services in those areas, for the opportunities for people to build wealth in those areas? Keep those questions in mind as we go through. Now, some outcomes of this. I talked a little bit about some of them a minute ago, but some outcomes of this is that in those best and desirable areas where whites lived, whites were given loans and mortgages. Black people were not. And if they were, they had higher interest rates. Didn't have as good of mortgages. Whites were subsidized to move into the suburbs, not just because of the GI Bill and white veterans, but they were subsidized anyway. Why? Because they were given loans for home ownership. They could move farther north in the city. They could move outside the city. Blacks, on the other hand, because they were not given home loans and were not helped out financially, they were left in the inner city redlined areas. They couldn't leave. They didn't really have the means to leave. Whites' rates of home ownership increased, and the values of white people's homes increased. Why? Because again, look, they are getting the best deals on mortgages and interest rates. They're getting the loans, whereas black people are not getting the loans at all, or they're getting poor interest rates. So the home ownership rates of black Americans did not increase as much. And when they did purchase homes, they were worse homes that were undervalued or devalued, or they were older, or they were falling apart, or whatever, because there also wasn't as much investment from the city or the state in black neighborhoods as there was in white neighborhoods. Remember, this is the time of separate but equal and everything else. Another result of this is that whites were therefore able to build wealth through home ownership in desirable areas and the suburbs, whereas blacks did not. So over time, white families accumulated wealth. Their value of their homes appreciated, whereas the values of black people's homes did not appreciate in nearly the same rate, in nearly the same way. So over the generations, right, the descendants of people who owned homes, up in these best areas, the descendants of those families, white descendants of those families, inherited the value of those homes. Whereas the descendants of people who were in redlined areas and definitely declining areas did not inherit wealth. And you see today, an outcome of this is a huge gap in inheritance between white Americans and Americans from other minority racial groups. White Americans have greater inheritances, and they are far more likely to have inheritances at all than other groups. And part of this can be traced back to the fact that decades ago, these policies were put in place that encouraged and incentivized and allowed white families to invest in homes and to have their wealth grow through the accrual of the value of their homes, whereas blacks did not. So another outcome of redlining is that white children went to better funded public schools. Why? Because in the United States, property taxes partially fund local school systems. So in areas where home values are higher, there are more taxes that go to fund schools, right? And so the schools are better funded than in poorer areas where home values are lower, and so there's fewer tax dollars going to fund the local public schools. This is why there are better schools in rich areas and worse schools in poorer areas all throughout the country. It's a very clear pattern. And it has to do with the differences in the values of property, the property values, the home values in those places. So white children went to better funded public schools. And during the time of integration, right after Brown versus the Board of Education that ruled separate but equal unconstitutional, when black children were bused to all white schools to force integration, white families didn't just accept black children into the schools to integrate. Many white families up and left. That's how they dealt with it. They engaged in what's called white flight. They left for the suburbs. They moved out of the city, and they moved to North Atlanta. They moved to other suburbs outside of the city, or in more extremities in the city. And they moved to districts that were all white, which left, again, black students going to schools that were still pretty much all black. Today, you can see my statistics here, over 50% of students attend a school that is 75% or more the same race or ethnicity, and 14% of students attend schools where nearly the whole student body is of a single race or ethnicity. Specifically, almost half of black and Latino students attend schools where 90 to 100% of the student body is non-white. School segregation today in K-12 public schools looks almost exactly like it did in the late 1960s, when we were still forcing integration, right, after the schools were segregated. So there was progress made throughout the 70s and 80s. Integration really increased, but starting really in the 80s at some point and then into the 90s, school segregation started really becoming apparent again. And this is partly due, large part due to residential segregation. So we've looked at the relationship in this class, between education and social class, as well as between parental social class and your own social class. So this is why that last point matters, is that the better housing that one has, the better schools their children can go to. The better schools that you go to, the more educational opportunities are available to you. So living in a redlined area with poorly funded public schools, and especially parents who are low income and have low education themselves, does not bode well for your outcomes. So redlining simply locked more and more black students or black families into this sort of cycle of low education and low poverty, or low education and high poverty. Having these assets, right, having these high home values, actually allowed whites to move to the suburbs because they had amassed some level of wealth through home ownership. They could sell it and leave and afford the expenses of doing so and the expenses of purchasing or building a new house in the suburbs, whereas blacks did not have that sort of assets, those sorts of assets, and they could not do that. Plus, there were racial housing covenants in the suburbs, which were policies and laws specifically prohibiting black families from moving into white suburbs. This was something that was legal back then. So these are some outcomes of redlining. The next institution I want to look at, we looked at institution of housing here and the ways in which the history of redlining created racially segregated neighborhoods, and we'll see how these persist today. But transportation is the second one that I want to look at. So as you can see here, I've got a map that highlights around in the mid-century, 1950s or so, prominent black neighborhoods in Atlanta. And I'm going to flip back and forth here between here and Google Maps in a minute. But prominent black neighborhoods in Atlanta. You can see Vine City, the West End, Summer Hill, Reynoldstown. You can sort of see I think this is I-75 or something, whatever becomes I-75-ish, running north-south here. And you can see what's going to become I-20 running east-west here. In 1956, as you can see, the interstate highway system was established and started being built to connect suburbs to cities. Now, what is interesting to note is that many of the interstates that crisscross the cities in the United States were placed where they are to cement racial segregation. I-20 through Atlanta, Interstate 20, it runs east to west, specifically was built through black neighborhoods on purpose to separate blacks on the south side of Atlanta and mostly whites on the north side of Atlanta. So I've got here, in the words of Mayor William Hartsfield, I-20 would serve as, quote, the boundary between the white and Negro communities. What happens here, and I think this is I-20 here, we'll look at Google Maps in a second, but you see these black areas, and if you zip back through, look at the redlined map here, that's sort of areas here that are highlighted, like Reynoldstown is over here. You can see them mapped on the redline map. I-20 cuts through these redlined areas. So it does a couple things, I-20 does. It bisects, right, splits in half black areas of the city, cutting them off from one another. It also segregates this wealthier white north side from this poorer, hazardous black side. And it cuts off people from the south from opportunities that are in the north part of Atlanta. There's now an interstate bisecting the two halves of Atlanta. So keep this in mind, that there's two halves of Atlanta, right? We're going to come back to this. You can also see here Auburn Avenue. There's a road called Auburn Avenue. This was a really really upwardly mobile black community in Atlanta in the 1950s and 60s. The Fortune magazine in 1956 described what was called Sweet Auburn Avenue as the richest Negro street in the world. Right? It was a solid middle class area. There were thriving businesses. There was the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which was huge, booming nightlife. It was gutted by I-20 construction. So let's see, what else we got here? Other issues with transportation. I-485 was another interstate that was proposed, but it was never built. And this is really curious. You might be saying, what is I-485? Well, I'll show you. I-485 was a connector like 400 that was proposed to go something like from here to here, right, north-south, through a lot of these best and still desirable white and politically influential neighborhoods. Well, white folks at the time organized and opposed this construction, and they stopped it. And instead, we got I-20 and whatever other ones that were built, right? I-75 and I-85. And I-485 was never built because of the opposition of the white people in that area. They were able to say no, whereas the black people living along I-20 were not able to organize and say no. They did not have that kind of power. Another interesting thing, and I don't know if you know this, there was a wall that was actually built. Where is it here? Yeah, it was built, I think, around here. There was a wall that was built. It was called the Atlanta Wall, or the Berlin Wall of Atlanta. And it was constructed in 1962 above a neighborhood called Cascade Heights, near a neighborhood called Cascade Heights in southwest Atlanta. And it was a physical wall, right? A physical barrier that was constructed to keep black people from moving northward. The issue here was a black doctor purchased a nice home in Cascade Heights and was targeted by white people, harassed, terrorized. And so white Atlantans built a wall so that black people would not move into white territory any further. This lasted about 2 months. There was a huge kind of outrage, international and national outrage over the Great Wall in Atlanta, or the Berlin Wall of Atlanta, and it was torn down after a couple months. But you can look up pictures of this. They actually built a wall. Okay, so let's look at Google Maps, because another interesting thing here to think about transportation and road infrastructure is that, curiously, if you've ever driven through Atlanta, you know that there's all sorts of confusing road names. There's like a ton of peach trees. But one of the unique phenomena about Atlanta is that there are a variety of roads that change names, that go north-south, that change names. Here's some, right? Briarcliff becomes Monroe. It's Briarcliff in the north, Monroe in the south. Parkway becomes Charles Allen. Cortland becomes, or Juniper becomes Cortland, and a variety of others. So let's open Google Maps. And we can look at Briarcliff and Monroe. Briarcliff and Monroe. Where are we at? Yeah. Oh, sorry, not Monroe. Moreland. Why am I saying Monroe? Did I say it wrong? Yeah, Moreland. So here's Briarcliff Road, north-south, Highway 42. And as it crosses Ponce de Leon Avenue, it becomes Moreland Avenue. So this is interesting. Why would Briarcliff switch to Moreland at Ponce de Leon? Here's another one. Parkway and Charles Allen. Okay, we're just going farther down Ponce de Leon. Here's Charles Allen Drive on the north side of Ponce de Leon. Go on the other side of Ponce de Leon, and it becomes Parkway Drive. It changes names across Ponce de Leon Avenue. All right, you can Google any of the others that I've listed here, Cortland and Juniper. Oops, Cortland and Juniper. Here we go. Juniper to the north, Cortland to the south. Here's North Avenue, right? So Ponce de Leon sort of becomes North Avenue as you go west. So we've got these different road names on the north side of Ponce de Leon and on the south side of Ponce de Leon. Like, why is that? Well, if you look here on this map of successful black neighborhoods, here's North Avenue. And so Ponce de Leon would be, is the same road going east. Look at what is south of North Avenue. It is black residences. And if we look back at our red line thing here, North Avenue and Ponce, is it this one? Something around here. You can see that south of North Avenue are red and yellow lined neighborhoods, black neighborhoods. North of North Avenue are predominantly white neighborhoods. So these street names were changed systematically in the middle part of the last century because white people did not want to share the same street addresses as black people. And so the names were changed north of Ponce de Leon Avenue and North Avenue to give them different names. So white people didn't have to have the same address. So that's pretty interesting. So we can compare the results of these prominent black neighborhoods, sort of like where they're located, to that redlining map and to the 2020 racial dot map, which I will show you in a second. This is going to be the kicker, right? All right. So outcomes of transportation infrastructure, of the ways that streets were named, of the ways that the interstates were built, is prosperous black businesses, neighborhoods like in Auburn Avenue, and communities were destroyed for construction. Most people who were displaced, whose homes were destroyed for the construction of I-20 were black, despite a minority of the city's residents being black. I think it was 37% of Atlanta's population was black, but 60% of the people who were relocated during the construction of I-20 were black. So almost double the percentage relative to their population in the city as a whole. In some other states, for some other interstates, 100% of the people who were relocated, whose homes and communities were destroyed for interstate construction, were black. Another outcome here is black neighborhoods were bisected, like I said, and cut off from one another, and cut off from the city center. Black Atlantans now and then tend to be concentrated in resource deserts and are subject to more environmental hazards. The interstates had other interesting outcomes as well. They increased suburbanization. Because what, interestingly, the interstates did, think of 75 and 85 running north-south through Atlanta, is that they allowed people to easily travel from the city to the suburbs. It was primarily white Americans who lived in the suburbs during that time. In Atlanta, it was primarily white folks who lived out in the northern Atlanta, the parts of northern Atlanta, the neighborhoods in northern Atlanta, and the suburbs north of Atlanta. So the interstates allowed them to travel home and then into the city for work. Black Americans did not have that luxury, right? The interstates didn't do that for them. Because they were poorer and had less resources to travel in the first place. They were less likely to own cars and all these other things. They were less likely to get jobs outside the city, of course, because they didn't live outside the city. And they wind up becoming sort of trapped inside red-lined areas in the city center in urban areas. So this allowed whites to live outside the city and have access to jobs and culture in the city center, but it did not allow blacks to go outside the city center, not just because of lack of transportation and money issues, but also because, again, we're in the 1960s. This is the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow is still legal. Segregation and racial discrimination were still legal. The Civil Rights Act has not yet been passed. The Fair Housing Act has not yet been passed. So all of this is totally legal. So these areas that were already redlined, in these areas, people didn't have much opportunity for home loans and mortgages until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And even that act didn't stop those practices, right? It's like any other law. When legislation is passed, it doesn't mean the thing just stops. Rather, we'll talk about the various other subtle ways, or not so subtle ways, that white Americans figured out how to continue to discriminate interpersonally and institutionally in the city of Atlanta. So another interesting thing here is if you think about public transportation. If you live in Atlanta, you know that our public transportation system is not the best. It doesn't have much range. It only spans Fulton and DeKalb counties, and there's some sort of like bus systems that they've worked out with some other counties, but it's a really, really small public transit system. And it has definitely a stigma as well. In 1972, MARTA begins, and it begins as a bus system in Fulton and DeKalb counties. All of the then white suburban counties rejected participating in MARTA by the early 1970s. Initially, a couple of them signed on, but when it came to funding it, they said no. So Gwinnett, Cobb, and Clayton all initially said no. And over the decades to today, right, 50 years later, all repeatedly reject the expansion of MARTA into their areas. And this is largely due to racial prejudice, especially in the past. The idea was that MARTA, if it expanded into the white suburbs, would bring black people, and therefore poverty and crime and all these things, the negative things that were associated with black people. It would also bring integration, which white people at the time, especially those who were moving to the suburbs, did not want. So the structure of MARTA, why MARTA kind of sucks today, is because of racial prejudice and discrimination in the past, right? It could have expanded into the suburbs in the past. We could have public transportation that moves people from Atlanta to Gwinnett County to Lawrenceville to Clayton County to Marietta, but we don't. We don't. And people continue to oppose these, but the votes are getting closer and closer to passing them, interestingly. Clayton County actually passed expansion in 2014, but nothing ever really happened with it, and it's kind of dead now. Gwinnett, in the last referendum recently, barely declined MARTA. The vote was 50.3% of voters blocked it. There's a difference of 1,000 votes. So it almost expanded to Gwinnett County, which has become, as has Cobb, much more racially diverse than in the past. So the failure of the MARTA expansion, right, is another thing, another institutional transportation related thing that served to continue to trap black people in the city and poor people in the city, limiting their opportunities and making traffic even worse. I probably mentioned at some point in some other lecture that one reason that traffic is bad is because interstates function so well, right? Because they function so well, more people use them. Because more people use them, we get traffic jams. That's only part of the story. It's a simple explanation for traffic jams. Another explanation of traffic jams is because roads were poorly designed to segregate black from white Americans. And public transportation was not expanded because white people wanted to maintain segregation in Atlanta. And therefore, we have worse traffic because nobody uses public transportation because it is not that great in Atlanta. So, I've been alluding to this racial dot map. You can search for ARC, ARCGIS, racial dot map, ARCGIS racial dot map. And you can see, actually, if you're on my online class, this is an option for a discussion post for you, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But if you look at the racial dot map, you can see it goes to New York, but I don't want to look at New York. I want to look at Atlanta. So in racial dot maps, or in dot maps, dots of color represent some number of whatever demographic variable you're looking at. In this case, it's number of people by race. You can see at this zoom level that one dot equals 193 people. And if you look at Atlanta, here one dot is 96 people. If you look at Atlanta, you see a bunch of yellow on the south side of Atlanta. Yellow, if you go over here, is non-Hispanic or Latino population, black or African American alone. So these are black or African American people clustered on the south side of Atlanta. If you look on the north side of Atlanta, you see all these brown dots, What is brown? White alone. So, what does this mean? This means, let's go all the way back to our redlining, right? All the way back to our redlining from 1935, where the south side of Atlanta is primarily black, redlined areas, and the north side of Atlanta is primarily white, wealthier parts of the city. And we can see how the white and the black parts of the city were bisected by I-20. We can talk about public transportation that prevented or extremely limited integration by keeping black Americans inside the city, by making it so they couldn't travel outside the city. We can see how the development of the interstates allowed whites to continue living in the suburbs and commute into the city. And we see that the modern racial residential pattern in Atlanta mirrors that of 100 years ago, and that which was institutionalized through policy, redlining, the developments of the interstates, the developments of transportation, all of the racist and discriminatory policies related to housing, like white neighborhood covenants and predatory mortgages and all these sorts of things. You can zoom in and you can look actually all the way down to the neighborhood level. And when you zoom in, you see more diversity at the neighborhood level. Here we got one dot is 6 people. And so you can zoom around. You can find your own neighborhood. So, you know, folks who live up in Lawrenceville in class, right? You can look up in Lawrenceville. And you can see that there are areas of concentration where there are fewer white or black people that have popped up in Atlanta, which is a very, you know, diverse metro Atlanta area. Is very diverse, especially up in Gwinnett County, which is up here in the upper right. But you can see a lot of this color blue, which is Hispanic or Latino population. You can see a lot of this dark blue, which is a lot of Asian Americans. But you get this real clear difference between north and south in Atlanta itself, right? And if you look at other cities, you see the same thing. You see Augusta, black in the south, white in the north. Columbia, South Carolina, black in the north and northeast, white in the south. Sumter looks sort of east-west. Birmingham, Alabama, black in the northwest, white in the south and southeast, south and east. Tuscaloosa, black in the south, white in the north. So this is not a phenomenon limited to Atlanta. This is all over the place. And it's not just the south. It's in northern cities as well, especially in the Rust Belt. You see the same thing in Chicago. Black areas of the city, Asian areas of the city, Hispanic areas of the city, where there's really extreme residential segregation. One that I always like to point out is Detroit. You can see 8 Mile. Right? This is 8 Mile Highway. Right here. Look at how clear a line. Living on one side, black neighborhoods. Living on the other side, white neighborhoods. Very segregated by one street. You've heard the term like the other side of the tracks or the wrong side of the tracks or something. That's what that kind of thing refers to. It's residential segregation across a road, some sort of dividing line, right? A road, a river, you know, an industrial block, or whatever it is. And you can see that sort of stuff all over the United States. So, you will have some chance to play around with this dot map more later on. But I want you to think about these questions, right? Just as you're watching. And you can also think about how you might see this sort of stuff in your own neighborhood, like on the ground level. Because like I said, if you zoom in, you'll see more diversity, you know, in many neighborhoods. When you zoom out, you start to see the aggregate picture. But you can think about what racial demographics are like where you live, like in your neighborhood. If you zoom all the way in on that census and that dot map, you can actually look at census tracts and zoom all the way in, and you can look at census blocks. So I looked at my census block. There's like 13 white people in my census block. I'm one of them. And then there's like 40 black people and 40 Hispanic people and a few Asian people or something. It's like people like kind of in my actual neighborhood. You can zoom down in that level on the dot map. It's really interesting. And so it is interesting for you to see then, think about your neighborhood, the supermarkets that are nearby, the stores that are nearby. What racial or ethnic enclaves exist where you live? How are they distinguished? Are the street signs or building signs in languages other than English? What about the markets, supermarkets, and stores? Are there supermarkets that aren't like Publix or Kroger? Are there like, Hispanic supermarkets or Asian supermarkets that are kind of specific to one ethnic group or another? If you go into kind of a typical American grocery store like Publix or Kroger, and you go to the ethnic food section or the international food section, if it has one, what kind of foods are there? And are those people represented in your neighborhood or not? Consider that all food is ethnic food, right? All food is food of a culture, right? People from some heritage or another. But only some of it gets labeled ethnic foods in the supermarket. What are the predominant like cultural celebrations that might be held in your area, in your neighborhood? You can think about those sort of things. So think about how race and ethnicity appear locally. There are many other maps that you can look at. There are maps that visualize race and income. There are maps that visualize education level. This is another dot map. And you can look at these other maps and lay them over the redlining map and lay them over the racial dot map and see how they correlate and see how they don't correlate too. I said earlier that formerly redlined areas have higher concentrations of resource deserts, including food deserts, which means that people who live there tend not to have access, or are more likely not to have access to, if it's a food desert, it's fresh food. If it's a care desert, it's like hospitals. If it's a healthcare desert, it's like hospitals or healthcare offices, healthcare facilities. If it's what do they call that? Green desert? There's basically deserts where there's no green space or like parks or something like that for people to go outside and enjoy the outdoors or exercise in. There's all sorts of different kinds of deserts. You can look at this redlining in Atlanta story map, which is super interesting. And it shows a variety of outcomes that are overlaid on the historical redlining map. I'll just look at that real quick. This is looking at race today in Atlanta. We're looking at Atlanta again. Black is predominantly, purple is predominantly black. Orange is predominantly white. The darker, the more predominant it is. You can look at this next one as you scroll down. It looks at unemployment rate. And you can see that higher unemployment rates in the south of Atlanta, lower unemployment rates in the north of Atlanta. Well, how is that map onto race? Well, easy. There's higher unemployment in the south, where there are more black Atlantans. There is lower unemployment in the north, where there are more white Americans or Atlantans. So you can see this correlation between unemployment and race in Atlanta. You can see the same thing here in terms of poverty. Higher poverty rates in the south, less in the north. Median income, higher in the north, lower in the south. So very clear correlation to race, very clear correlation to unemployment, and clear correlation to redlining. So it's going to show you this redlining map, and it's going to allow you to do these sorts of slider things, right? So you can see that formerly redlined areas, right, with the exception of some gentrified areas like in East Atlanta, are primarily black. And these green areas, right, the green and the blue, the Class A and Class B, the best and still desirable areas, are still areas that are primarily white. So the way that Atlanta looks in terms of a lot of these things really maps onto the old redlining maps. You can see one related to environmental inequalities and how environmental inequalities trace back to redlining policies. I told you that people who live in redlined areas, they have worse health outcomes, they have lower life expectancy, they have higher rates of asthma, all of these things, because the areas themselves have much higher risk of environmental hazards. You're much more likely to live among environmental hazards in formerly redlined areas. And then we looked at the Opportunity Atlas, so you can go back to that if you want to, but think about all this stuff in terms of the Opportunity Atlas. So another thing that you can do, and this is another option for your discussion post this week, is to play what's called the Parable of the Polygons. So this is a simulation of how residential segregation inevitably results when people have only a slight preference of living alongside people like them. This is really cool. It projects scenarios for you, several different kinds of scenarios. You can play with the amount of bias that people might have, the amount of preference, in other words, that they may have for living next to people like them. And you see that people will wind up sorting themselves in terms of race regarding where they live. So this is another interesting one, but it leads to the conclusion here that even in a world, in these simulations, where bias never existed, people having preferences will create biased outcomes. So alternatively, in our world, bias exists, right? It already exists. Institutional discrimination and housing segregation already exists. We're born into this world. Being unbiased isn't enough. It doesn't fix segregation. So playing this will help you think about how residential segregation might be undone in the future. So some final points here, and I'll read. This is like the one slide that I scripted. So this lecture has shown how redlining, residential segregation, white flight, and the development of interstates and public transportation in Atlanta have produced discriminatory outcomes for Black Atlantans. If you look, going off script here, at different levels of wealth inequality and every other metric, white Atlantans and white people in the country fare better than Black Atlantans and Black people in the country. This is not for individual reasons or reasons related to the social group of Black Americans, but it is related to reasons of institutional discrimination, as I have showed in this lecture. Redlining, residential segregation, white flight, development of interstates and public transportation. These phenomena have also shaped negative outcomes for other racial minorities and poor people into the modern era. At the same time, they have produced positive outcomes for white and wealthier people. Redlining was banned with the 1968 Fair Housing Act, after which, although it was no longer legal to discriminate in housing based on race, people found plenty of other more subtle ways to do it. The discriminatory practice known as mortgage discrimination, where lenders denied loans to minorities seeking home ownership, was common all the way through the 1990s, when many of you watching this were born. And they may have affected your parents' housing opportunities, and thus played a role in where you grew up and the opportunities you had by virtue of your geographic location, the schools you went to, the wealth you might inherit. So in fact, mortgage and interest rate discrimination continue today. It's illegal. But if you just Google mortgage discrimination, interest rate discrimination, you can see tons of big cases still where people of color are being systematically denied home loans, auto loans, and so on, or paying higher interest rates than white consumers. Even when minorities earn more money or have better credit than whites, they oftentimes will be given worse interest rates or denied loans more frequently. Another one of these subtle means of racial discrimination was actually exacerbated by the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and that's white flight. And I'll talk about this for a minute and give you a personal example. Like we talked about, white flight had already begun in the 1950s after public school integration, and it continued in the midst of efforts at housing integration, and it continues today in various forms. My parents actually did this, right? They engaged in white flight. So I, as a child, engaged, right, as much as a child can engage in white flight. I grew up in a predominantly white area in Jonesboro, Georgia, in Clayton County, in the 1980s. It became less and less white over the years. I actually found census data for racial demographics over time, and you can find this for where you grew up too if you want to see how racial demographics have changed in the place you grew up. In 1980, Clayton County, Georgia was 91.7% white and 7% black. By 1990, 10 years later, it was 72.4% white and 23.8% black. Another 10 years, by the year 2000, it was only 37.9% white and 51.6% black. So it had flipped, right? White people were now the minority, numerical minority in Clayton County, and black people were the numerical majority. My parents decided to move in 1997 to a neighboring city called Peachtree City, which is in Fayette County, Georgia. Peachtree City, in the year 2000, was 90% white and 4.1% black in 2000, just like Jonesboro in 1980. It was like going back in time. All of a sudden, everyone looked like us again. All of our neighbors were white. When I went to school the first year, it was very strange. I was not used to it. I remember being so weirded out not having diverse kinds of students in my classes. It was really, 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 really strange. My parents always said things about Jonesboro, like the neighborhood has gone downhill, to explain why we moved. What they meant was that the neighborhood had become predominantly black and whites were now the numerical minority. That's what they meant. That's kind of coded language, right? The neighborhood has gone downhill, right? It's not like it was when we moved here. My step-grandmother, as many older white people are, was especially fearful of integration. I remember one time, and this was in like 2010, she told me that black people in Jonesboro were wearing t-shirts that said, "First we come for Clayton County, then we come for Fayette County," referring to them taking over white counties. This is, of course, an absurd white urban legend, to stoke fear about black people infiltrating good white neighborhoods. And this is exactly what redlining did, right? If you look at the redlined neighborhoods on those redlining maps, the descriptions from Hulk, they use the term infiltrate. They say that black people or immigrants are infiltrating neighborhoods, and that's why they're declining or less desirable or hazardous. So this same idea, right? Near 100 years later, my step-grandma telling me this thing that she probably read on Facebook with other white people saying, the black people are moving in and like it's part of some sort of plan or plot. They're taking over all of our homes, all of our neighborhoods. So my parents' parents before them did the same thing in the 1960s. They engaged in white flight. They moved from parts of central Atlanta that were becoming integrated, and they moved to white northern Atlanta. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not my grandparents or my parents held racist attitudes. They engaged in racist behavior by fleeing declining or hazardous neighborhoods that were integrating, and they fled them to move to good white neighborhoods. Seen in the context of this lecture, their behaviors aligned with the discriminatory patterns of unequal treatment that black people that we've talked about. Redlining, residential segregation, the development of Atlanta's transportation infrastructure, lack of access to housing loans, that produced and continue to produce negative outcomes for blacks, and that produced and continue to produce more positive outcomes for whites. My parents simply took the path of least resistance and acted according to the rules of the social structure. I want you to consider how to alleviate residential segregation. I want you to consider how to act against the rules of the social structure, how the rules of the social structure might be changed, how to address other forms of institutional discrimination that produce unequal outcomes for different racial and ethnic groups, or that produce unequal outcomes for different social classes as well, because it's very hard to distinguish sometimes race and class. So I hope this was interesting for you to hear about or to learn about Atlanta itself. I want to point out this final thing, right, is that these problems won't just sort themselves out. And the reason they won't just sort themselves out is because they are institutional. they actually require active effort and change, not just from people individually, but from organizations. Policies and laws can be created to address these issues. One reason that this doesn't happen, or that it happens sometimes in a very surface level sort of way that doesn't result in much change, is because people who benefit and have benefited from these sorts of policies and the ways that these policies have shaped housing, education, are hesitant to go against the path of least resistance, right? They're hesitant to go against the social structure. They're hesitant to rock the boat. They're hesitant to do anything that might threaten their own well-being or that of their own social group. And so most people choose to do nothing. Doing nothing does not allow these problems to sort themselves out, right? One argument is that, oh, well, things are getting better, right? We live in a colorblind society. Like, look how much better things are getting. This is not the case. I've shown during this lecture that the residential racial look of Atlanta is really similar to what it was about 100 years ago. The racial wealth gap is huge, is more than it was in 1963 when the civil rights legislation was passed, or 1964, whichever date that was. Things don't just work themselves out. Institutional discrimination perpetuates itself. And when people don't act, it simply perpetuates the status quo. So I'll leave you with that thought. Next week, we're going to talk about gender and sexuality. That's the last of the 3 topics on social inequality that we're going to look at. So again, I hope this was interesting for you. Go ahead, go over to the discussion post if you're in my class, and choose one of the 2 options there. I look forward to reading. And there are a variety of resources at the end of these slides for you. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.